to it with our team of reporters. NBC News intelligence and national security reporter Ken Delanian joins us from our D.C. bureau. NBC's Hallie Jackson is at the White House. Also in Washington, White House bureau chief for The Washington Post and MSNBC political analyst Phil Rucker. Ken, let's start with this Don Jr. meeting. This idea that Bannon says that it was treasonous for Don Jr., Jared Kushner, Paul Manafort to have a meeting with a Russian national inside Trump Tower. What is that going to mean for the Russia investigation?
I think it could mean quite a bit, Katie. Let me just read you the key quote you're talking about. This allegedly from Bannon. The three senior guys in the campaign thought it was a good idea to meet with a foreign government inside Trump Tower in the conference room on the 25th floor with no lawyers. They didn't have any lawyers. Even if you thought this was not treasonous, unpatriotic, or bad expletive, and I happen to think it's all of that, you should have called the FBI immediately. Now, what's interesting about this, Katie, is this happens to be the reaction, as you probably well know, of every campaign professional, every FBI official, every intelligence official I've ever talked to about this meeting. Of course you wouldn't take this meeting, you would call the FBI. But the fact that it's coming from one of Donald Trump's formerly closest advisors may be relevant to the Mueller investigation if he ever has to convince a jury or the Congress that this was something Donald Trump wanted to cover up. Because remember, there's no allegation that Trump knew about this meeting when it was happening, but there is a question about how he characterized it later. He wrote a statement saying it was all about adoptions, which it plainly was not. And we believe, we've reported that this is part of the obstruction of justice inquiry that Mueller is conducting. And so the fact that Bannon thought this meeting was treasonous, I think, could loom significant as this investigation moves forward.
Hallie, the president himself said at one point, and hopefully you can correct me if I'm not getting the nuance of this, but didn't the president at one point himself say, of course you take a meeting like that?
Steve Bannon definitely wouldn't have taken a meeting. Katie, he in fact said in this book that if he did, it was sort of this convoluted connecting the dots. He'd take it at the Holiday Inn in Manchester and have a lawyer talk to another lawyer and then print it out in Breitbart or someplace like that. So Bannon is making clear when you talk with Ken sort of where he is on that, at least publicly and on the record. You're right in that a lot of this comes from Steve Bannon on the record, but a lot of it does not. There's other sources that Wolf clearly talked to, although what we have heard from the White House in the last, 30 minutes here has been, Michael Wolff did not have access to anybody who knew anything at all inside Donald Trump's inner circle. So I think we have a piece of this really remarkable statement, the pushback coming out from the president himself, the president in his own statement, essentially saying that when Bannon lost his job, he also lost his mind, saying Steve Bannon had nothing to do with me or my presidency. He continues, Bannon was a staffer who worked for me after I had already won the nomination by defeating 17 candidates, often described as the most talented field ever assembled in the Republican Party. Couple of things to this. Number one, Steve Bannon did have something to do with Donald Trump and his presidency. Number two, the person who wrote this statement, and we're working on nailing this down, this sounds straight from the mouth of Donald Trump. I've spoken with a couple of sources in the last 45 minutes or so. Donald Trump is angry. Livid is one word that was used to describe him on the phone today, talking about the concerns and sort of the fury about what is happening with this. I think you are seeing sort of unfiltered Donald Trump there. And then his staff has now come out in just the last couple of minutes with their own, you could call it pushback, you could call it cleanup. Stephanie Grisham, who represents the First Lady, she's the communications director for Melania Trump, and Sarah Sanders, the press secretary, of course, who will be holding her briefing in about 55 minutes here, talking about how this is something that should be on the bargain fiction shelf and not the journalism shelf. Not surprising that the team, though, would push back against some of what Wolff claims to say has happened, including that Melania Trump was near tears on Inauguration Day, that she was in tears on election night, too. So there's a lot here.
There's a lot in the book, and we have the book. We've been going through it. There's a ton of quotes in there about how the Trump family was feeling on election night, what they were feeling on Inauguration Day, and what it's like inside the White House. Not all of this comes from Steve Bannon. Hallie, you're right to reiterate that. Phil, the president obviously, though, is focusing on Steve Bannon because Steve Bannon seems to be at least the first headline, major headline in this book. But let's remember, Donald Trump is a fan, or at least has been a fan, of Steve Bannon. Here's what he said about his old chief strategist, his former chief strategist, back in October.
Well, I have a very good relationship, as you know, with Steve Bannon. Steve's been a friend of mine for a long time. I like Steve a lot. Steve is doing what Steve thinks is the right thing.
That was after Steve was fired. So what does that mean for Bannon's credibility here?
Well, look, we know that President Trump and Bannon actually stayed in touch in the months since he was fired. They've had occasional phone calls. Steve Bannon has considered himself sort of an outside advisor and has had a line into the president at times off and on. Over these last few months, clearly they're at a breaking point right now. But it's not like the day Steve Bannon left the White House, he lost all of his influence with this president. And he's also been a political force on the outside with some of Trump's supporters and his base. And one note, Katie, about the sourcing that I think is really important here. At the bottom of the excerpt in New York Magazine of the Wolf book excerpt, there's a note about the sourcing, and it says that the president sat for interviews with Wolf and that the president encouraged most of his senior staff in the White House to participate in the book. And there are a number of senior staffers just in that excerpt alone who are quoted on the record, including Katie Walsh, who was the deputy chief of staff of the White House for the first few months of the so it's just not true to say that this is all sort of fiction made up by sources who don't have any access to this White House.
No doubt about that. I mean, I'm just looking at another quote from page 16 of this book saying, quoting Sam Nunberg, who used to work for Donald Trump, was on the campaign early on, but has been for quite some time a close associate of Donald Trump, talking about how he was trying to explain the Constitution to Donald Trump. He said, I got as far as the Fourth Amendment before his finger is pulling down on his lip and his eyes are rolling back in his head. Wolf also talks about why people in the real estate business don't generally get into politics or get into a position of extreme power like the President of the United States, because real estate often depends on government favor and is a preferred exchange currency for problem cash. Money laundering. Ken, listen, you look at what Robert Mueller is doing right now and the team that he's putting in place to look into the president and potentially look into his finances, whether or not they're getting anything from Deutsche Bank, whether or not they've seen Donald Trump's tax returns. We don't know that. It seems like this book is going to could be pretty damning.
Yeah, and that was another really explosive quote from Bannon where he said basically this investigation is all about money laundering and they're going to go through Manafort and Jared Kushner to get to Donald Trump. Now, what's interesting about that is a common view among legal experts and intelligence officials I talk to all the time about this case, which is that collusion with Russia may not be the biggest issue here. It's very difficult to prove, and it's not even actually a crime. That Donald Trump may have more jeopardy, and Jared Kushner may, in terms of their real estate business and the question of whether they did unsavory business with foreigners, with Russians. Remember, Donald Trump Jr. said in 2008 a disproportionate amount of our assets are coming from Russia. That's never been explained. But the Steve Bannon is saying it, one of the closest people to Trump world, is remarkable. And I think if you're Robert Mueller and his team, you're wanting to talk to Steve Bannon today about why he believes that and what does he know in particular about money laundering. One
little other thing about this Don Jr. meeting and where the president fell on it, just outside of this book, it's a good reminder for everybody that Donald Trump did say in July in Paris, Donald Trump the president, not Donald Trump Jr., most people would have taken that meeting. Also describing that his son as a wonderful young man. Again, the president of the United States saying most people would have taken that meeting.